Distant laughter echoes. Lockers slam. A group of students whispers, eyes locked on one girl. Lillian Carter, clutching her books, head down, trying to disappear. Madison mocking, "Oh look, it's Little Miss Nobody. You're actually going on stage tonight? This is gonna be hilarious." Lillian swallows hard, heart pounding. The whole school expects her to fail, to be a joke. But what they don't know, tonight, she's about to shock them all. The crisp autumn wind whispered through the narrow streets of Montgomery High, tugging at golden leaves and scattering them across the worn pavement. The school building loomed ahead, brick walls dull with age, windows reflecting the overcast sky, and students bustling in and out, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Inside the crowded hallway, 16-year-old Lillian Carter walked with her head slightly bowed, her worn-out sneakers scuffing against the tiled floor. Her backpack, faded and patched at the seams, hung off one shoulder, the weight of her textbooks threatening to pull her down. Lillian knew better than to make eye contact. In a school where brand names and expensive gadgets determined one's social worth, she was an easy target. She clutched her notebook closer to her chest, a lifeline of scribbled dreams, song lyrics, and poetry that no one ever saw. The moment she stepped into the main hallway, the familiar sneers and whispers began. "Nice shoes, Carter. Get those from a thrift store?" sneered Madison Brooks, the queen bee of Montgomery High, flipping her sleek blonde hair over her shoulder. Her posse of followers giggled, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Lillian clenched her jaw but didn't respond. Engaging would only make things worse. A foot suddenly shot out, and before she could react, she stumbled forward, her books flying out of her arms and skidding across the floor. Laughter erupted around her as she landed hard on her knees. "Oops, clumsy much?" Madison smirked, feigning innocence. The humiliation burned like fire beneath Lillian's skin, but she forced herself to remain silent. Scrambling to gather her books, she kept her gaze fixed on the floor, ignoring the camera phones capturing her disgrace. Then, a voice broke through the mockery. "Leave her alone, Madison," said Ethan Parker, a quiet but well-respected student with shaggy brown hair and kind, thoughtful eyes. He knelt to help Lillian pick up her books, his expression unreadable. Madison rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, Ethan. Defending charity cases now." Ethan didn't respond to her, instead handing Lillian her notebook. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and something in his gaze told her he saw beyond her ragged clothes and silence. But kindness was fleeting at Montgomery High. The bell rang, and the crowd dispersed, leaving Lillian to swallow her embarrassment alone. She pushed through the day in a haze, her thoughts tangled in shame and frustration. But she had one solace, one secret that no amount of ridicule could take away. That night, in the privacy of her tiny bedroom, Lillian sat by the cracked mirror and whispered the only truth that mattered. "They don't know who I really am." And soon they would. The auditorium of Montgomery High had never meant much to Lillian Carter. It was just another space where she felt invisible. A stage where the popular kids basked in the limelight while she lingered in the shadows. But this week, the air buzzed with excitement. The annual talent showcase was coming up, an event where students flaunted their skills before a packed audience of peers, teachers, and even local talent scouts. For most, it was a chance to shine. For Lillian, it was just another reminder of where she didn't belong. That was until Mrs. Reynolds, the school's choir director, stopped her after class. "Lillian," the older woman said, adjusting her glasses, "I heard you humming in the hallway the other day." Lillian's heart clenched. Had she been that careless? She always kept her voice low, singing only when no one was around. Mrs. Reynolds gave a knowing smile. "You have a beautiful voice. Have you ever thought about performing?" Lillian immediately shook her head. "Oh no, I don't sing in front of people." "You should." Mrs. Reynolds' voice was gentle yet firm. "You have something special, and talent like that shouldn't stay hidden." Lillian's chest tightened. The words stirred something inside her, something fragile and long buried. Singing had always been her escape, the one thing that made her feel whole. But the thought of standing before the same people who humiliated her, exposing that part of herself, it was unthinkable. Still, Mrs. Reynolds pressed a flyer into her hand. "Think about it," she said before walking away. Lillian stood frozen, staring at the bold letters. Talent Showcase. Sign UPS end tomorrow. The next day, as Lillian walked through the halls, whispers of the upcoming show surrounded her. Madison Brooks and her clique were already boasting about their choreographed dance routine, and others excitedly discussed their acts. Guitar solos, stand-up comedy, even a spoken word performance. She shouldn't even be considering this. It was crazy. But that night, alone in her small bedroom, Lillian picked up the flyer again. Her fingers traced the edges as she imagined stepping onto that stage. Imagine the moment when, just for once, people weren't laughing at her, but listening. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Then, in a surge of defiance, she grabbed a pen and wrote her name down. The next morning, Lillian turned in the sign-up sheet before she could change her mind. But as she walked away from the office, a voice rang out. "No, freaking way." Her stomach plummeted. Madison Brooks had the paper in her manicured hands, eyes wide with amusement. Lillian's pulse thundered as Madison read it aloud. "Lillian Carter singing? This is hilarious." Her friends burst into laughter. "Oh my God, are you serious?" One of them snickered. "Is this some kind of joke?" Madison's smirk widened. "Oh, I can't wait for this. This is gonna be so good." The sarcasm was sharp enough to slice through Lillian's chest. She could already see it, the mockery, the snickers, the humiliation waiting on that stage. Maybe she'd made a mistake. Maybe she should back out before it was too late. But then she remembered something. Talent like that shouldn't stay hidden. Mrs. Reynolds had said it with certainty, as if she knew something Lillian didn't yet believe about herself. And for the first time, Lillian wasn't just going to accept being the girl they laughed at. She lifted her chin. "Guess you'll have to wait and see," she said before walking away, her hands trembling, but her heart finally beating with something other than fear. The days leading up to the Montgomery High Talent Showcase felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of humiliation. Lillian Carter had spent years trying to blend in, to survive the relentless judgment of people like Madison Brooks. And now, by signing up, she had painted a target on her back. The news spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, the entire school was buzzing with speculation. Lillian Carter? Singing? That's gotta be a joke. I bet she sounds like a dying cat. Maybe she lost a bet. Lillian forced herself to keep her head high, even as the whispers followed her like shadows. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the sabotage. Started small. Her locker jammed the morning after she signed up. Someone had stuffed gum into the lock. It took the janitor 20 minutes to pry it open, making her late for class. Then, her music notebook went missing, the one with her lyrics, her practice notes, everything. She found it later in the trash outside the cafeteria, soaked in milk and torn in half. And then, 3 days before the showcase, she walked into the music room to find the piano keys covered in Vaseline. A cruel prank meant to ruin her practice session. She gritted her teeth. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But doubt gnawed at her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if, the moment she opened her mouth, the entire school burst into laughter? What if Madison was right? That evening, as she walked home, the autumn wind cut through her thin sweater. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. "Hey, Lillian!" She turned, surprised to see Ethan Parker jogging toward her. "Hey!" she said hesitantly. Ethan was one of the few people at school who had never mocked her, but he also wasn't exactly a close friend. "You're really doing it, huh?" he asked, falling into step beside her. She sighed. "Apparently." Ethan grinned. "Good. I think you'll be great." She gave a hollow laugh. "You don't even know if I can sing." He shrugged. "True. But I do know that it takes guts to do something everyone thinks you can't. And I think that's pretty cool." Lillian stared at him, unsure of what to say. No one had ever called her cool before. He hesitated before speaking again. "Look, I know Madison and her group are making this hell for you. But don't let them win. She clenched her fists. What if they're right? What if I get up there and make a fool of myself? Ethan stopped walking and turned to her. What if you get up there and prove them wrong? Lillian's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said that to her before. She swallowed hard and nodded. The next day, during final rehearsals, Lillian sat in the empty auditorium, staring at the vast stage. The other contestants were running through their performances. Some dancing, some playing instruments, some belting high notes with confidence. And then there was her, a girl with no training, no experience, and a school full of people waiting for her to fail. Her stomach twisted. She couldn't do this. She turned, ready to walk away, when a voice stopped her. Are you running? Lillian turned to see Mrs. Reynolds watching her from the side of the stage. Lillian's throat tightened. I don't think I can do this. Mrs. Reynolds nodded slowly. Fear is a powerful thing. It can chain you down, make you believe lies about yourself. She sat beside Lillian and spoke gently. Tell me, Lillian, when you sing, really sing, how do you feel? Lillian hesitated, then whispered, like I'm free. Mrs. Reynolds smiled. Then don't let fear take that from you. Lillian blinked back tears. She had spent so much of her life trapped, by her circumstances, by people's perceptions, by her own doubts. But singing had always been hers, and she wasn't going to let them take it away. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and looked at the stage. Tomorrow she would stand on it, and she would not back down. The night of the Montgomery High Talent Showcase arrived, and the air inside the packed auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents, students, and faculty filled the seats, eager to witness the performances. The massive stage was illuminated by bright spotlights, the velvet curtains framing the performers as they stepped forward, one by one, to showcase their talents. Backstage, Lillian Carter stood frozen, gripping the fabric of her dress with trembling fingers. The muffled cheers from the audience felt like distant echoes. Her name was listed near the end of the program, a placement that left her plenty of time to drown in anxiety. She could hear Madison Brooks and her friends giggling nearby. They hadn't even bothered to lower their voices. This is going to be so embarrassing, Madison whispered, loud enough for Lillian to hear. I almost feel bad for her. The laughter that followed stung like a slap. Lillian clenched her fists, heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Then she heard footsteps approach. You ready? She turned to see Ethan Parker, his expression calm but encouraging. She forced a shaky smile. I don't know if I can do this. Ethan tilted his head. You can. But the question is, do you want to? Lillian swallowed hard. I don't want to be a joke. Ethan's eyes softened. Then don't let them make you one. The words hit deep. For so long, she had let Madison and the others define her. Let them decide what she was worth. But what if she stopped letting them? The thought ignited something deep inside her. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. Next up, Lillian Carter. The crowd hushed, then murmurs spread through the audience. Lillian could feel their skepticism before she even stepped forward. Her legs were unsteady as she walked toward the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The microphone felt too heavy in her hand. Then she saw them, the sea of faces staring at her, waiting, expecting failure. Madison sat in the front row, smirking, phone in hand, ready to record her downfall. A lump formed in Lillian's throat. She took a deep breath, and then, she closed her eyes and sang. At first, the sound was barely above a whisper. A soft, trembling note, fragile as glass. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. But then she let go. Her voice grew stronger, stretching into the space, rich and full. It carried through the auditorium with a haunting melody, the kind that made people stop, listen, feel. The laughter vanished. A hush fell over the crowd. Lillian poured everything into the song. The years of ridicule, the pain of being overlooked, the quiet strength she had clung to in the darkest moments. Her voice trembled with raw emotion, weaving heartbreak and hope into every note. And then she opened her eyes. The audience sat stunned. Madison Brooks' smirk was gone, her eyes wide with disbelief. Even Mrs. Reynolds looked teary-eyed. And then the auditorium erupted. The applause was deafening, rising like a wave that crashed over Lillian in pure, overwhelming sound. Cheers, whistles, people standing to clap. For her. Lillian's breath hitched. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was seen, heard, respected. She had won not a trophy, not a title, but something far greater. She had proven them wrong. For a few seconds after Lillian Carter finished singing, she simply stood there, breathless, stunned, overwhelmed. The applause surged around her like a crashing wave, drowning out every cruel whisper, every doubt, every moment she had ever felt invisible. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. Was this real? Had she really just done that? Backstage, Mrs. Reynolds wiped away tears, looking at Lillian with something close to pride. Ethan Parker stood near the curtains, grinning like he'd known all along that this would happen. But the most shocking reaction came from Madison Brooks. Lillian's longtime tormentor sat frozen in her seat, phone still gripped in her manicured hand. But there was no smug grin now, no laughter, only disbelief. Lillian met Madison's gaze for a fleeting moment, and Madison looked away first. Something shifted inside Lillian then, something deep and undeniable. She didn't need Madison's approval. She never had. She had her own voice, and now the world had heard it. As Lillian walked off stage, the energy backstage had changed. Before, she had been ignored, dismissed. A ghost walking the halls of Montgomery High. Now, a group of students from the choir, ones who had never spoken to her before, congratulated her. "That was amazing," one girl gushed. "I didn't even know you could sing like that." Lillian blinked in surprise, nodding shyly. Then Ethan appeared beside her. "Told you," he said with a smirk. She let out a breathless laugh. Okay, you were right." He nudged her shoulder playfully. "Damn right I was." Just then, Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward, her eyes filled with something warm and unspoken. "You found your voice tonight, Lillian." Lillian's throat tightened. Maybe she had. The next morning, the entire school was still buzzing about Lillian's performance. The video of her singing had gone viral overnight, spreading through social media like wildfire. People replayed the clip, stunned by the girl they had once ignored. And Madison Brooks? She had never looked more furious. Lillian passed her in the hallway, expecting another cruel remark, another taunt. Instead, Madison just glared and turned away. For the first time, she had nothing to say. And Lillian? She smiled, because for the first time in her life, she had won. Lillian Carter had always walked through the halls of Montgomery High with her head down, hoping to go unnoticed, to escape ridicule, to survive. But today, everything was different. People smiled at her in the hallways. Some even stopped to talk to her, to tell her how incredible her performance had been. The same students who had once ignored or mocked her were now looking at her with respect. Lillian didn't quite know what to do with it, but she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer invisible. That afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds called her into the music room. "I sent a video of your performance to a friend of mine," she said with a small smile. "She's a vocal coach for an arts academy nearby. She'd like to meet you." Lillian's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean like real training?" Mrs. Reynolds nodded. "You have a gift, Lillian, and I think it's time you let the world hear it." Lillian felt something stir inside her. Not fear, not doubt, but something stronger. Hope. As Lillian left the music room, she nearly bumped into Madison Brooks. For a long moment, the two girls just stared at each other. Madison's expression was unreadable, something between frustration and reluctant acknowledgement. Finally, she sighed and muttered, "You were good." Lillian didn't need her approval, but hearing it still felt like a small victory. She met Madison's gaze, standing tall, and replied, "I know." And then, for the first time, she walked away from Madison Brooks without fear. That evening, Lillian sat in her room, watching the video of her performance on her phone. She barely recognized the girl on the screen, the one who stood on that stage, fearless, unshaken, powerful. She had spent years believing she was small, insignificant, unworthy. But the truth was, she had always been more. She had let people define her for too long. Now she defined herself, and she would never be silent again. To anyone who had ever been mocked, overlooked, or underestimated. To anyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Lillian's story was proof that they were. That sometimes, the only thing standing between who you are and who you can become is the courage to step forward and speak. Because the moment you find your voice, the world has no choice but to listen.